My name is Ezekiel Harding. I'm a wildlife officer who witnessed the first 72 hours of what people now call the Whisperer zombie outbreak. I tracked predators for a living, but nothing prepared me for hunting, or being hunted by, these infected. 3 days ago, I found strange fungal growths near Riverdale. Now I'm one of the few survivors with scientific insight into how these monsters operate. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I'm recording this as a record of what happened. If anyone ever finds this, maybe you can use what I learned to stay alive. My name is Ezekiel Harding, but everyone called me Zeke. I was a wildlife conservation officer for the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources, stationed in the Platte River Valley. I specialized in predator-prey dynamics and ecosystem management. Before all this, I spent 10 years in Yellowstone working on wolf reintroduction programs before transferring here 3 years ago to manage invasive species and monitor wildlife populations. I'm barricaded inside the North Fork Ranger Station now. It's been 72 hours since the first confirmed infection in Riverdale County. 3 days that changed everything. The infected are outside. I can hear them whispering to each other. That's what we call them now. Whisperers. Their hushed communications are like nothing I've ever heard from humans. More like the coordinated movements of a wolf pack than random zombie attacks you'd see in movies. Let me start at the beginning because the signs were there. We just didn't recognize them for what they were. It was late September and we'd been having unusually warm, humid weather for weeks. The forecast kept calling for it to break, but it never did. Stagnant air, temperatures in the high 80s, humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin. Not normal for Nebraska this time of year. I first noticed something was off about 3 weeks ago during my regular wildlife population surveys. The migration patterns were all wrong. Species that should have been moving south were staying put or moving in completely different directions. Bird flocks were fragmented. Deer were abandoning their usual territories. I documented everything meticulously in my field journal. It's a habit from my scientific training. At first I thought it might be climate-related behavioral changes, but the speed of the shift was unprecedented. Animals seemed agitated, nervous. The prey species, rabbits, deer, even small rodents, they were behaving like there was a major predator presence, but our apex predator populations hadn't increased. Then the reports from local farmers started coming in. Jim Henderson called about his cattle acting strangely, refusing to enter certain pastures, becoming aggressive with each other. The Millers reported their normally friendly farm dog had attacked their youngest son before running off into the fields. Wildlife calls increased tenfold. Coyotes appearing in suburban areas during daylight hours. Unusual aggression from typically shy species. Around the same time, I began finding strange fungal growths in certain areas of the valley. They weren't like anything in our regional field guides. Pale, branching structures with unusual fruiting bodies that seemed to emit a fine mist when disturbed. I took samples, documented locations, and sent some specimens to Dr. Eliza Chen at the University of Nebraska's mycology department. "This doesn't match anything in our database," she told me over the phone. "The cellular structure is bizarre, almost like it's designed to become airborne when mature. Where exactly did you find these?" I explained the locations, all low-lying areas with poor air circulation, high humidity. She promised to run more tests. That was the last normal conversation we ever had. 2 days after sending those samples, I got a call from Jim Henderson. His voice was strained, barely recognizable. "Something's wrong with the cattle," he said. They're not right. And Margaret isn't feeling well either. Can you come check it out?" I drove out to the Henderson farm that morning. It was unusually quiet when I arrived. Farm equipment was abandoned in the fields, a tractor still running with no one in it. The livestock pens were open, but I didn't see any animals. No sounds of chickens or pigs. Nothing. I called out for Jim several times. No answer. The farmhouse door was open, so I went inside, announcing myself. The house was empty, but there were signs of hasty departure. Half-eaten breakfast on the table, a purse spilled over on the counter. That's when I heard something from the barn, a wet, raspy breathing sound. I went to investigate, calling Jim's name again. I found him in the back stall, but it wasn't really Jim anymore. His skin had a grayish pallor with visible veins pushing against the surface like tree roots under pavement. His eyes were dilated so wide the iris was just a thin ring. When he saw me, he didn't speak. He whispered, a hoarse, sibilant sound that wasn't quite words. I backed away, but he moved with unexpected speed. Not shambling like zombies in the movies. This was something different. Efficient, predatory movement. I managed to get outside and into my truck, but as I was starting the engine, I saw Margaret emerge from behind the barn. She had the same appearance, and when she saw Jim pursuing me, they began communicating in those whispers. They were coordinating, working together, like wolves cutting off escape routes for prey. I floored it out of there and immediately tried to call it in, but cell service was already becoming patchy. I got through to the sheriff's department, but they sounded overwhelmed. Reports were coming in from all over the county about mass illness and violent behavior. They told me to stay put and wait for instructions. Instead, I went back to my field station and tried to contact Dr. Chen. When I finally got through, she sounded terrified. "The samples you sent, there's something very wrong with them," she said. "The spores are unlike anything we've seen. They're attacking the lab cultures in ways that don't make sense. My research assistant was exposed yesterday, and now he's in the hospital with rapidly advancing symptoms. They're quarantining the whole building. Zeke, I think this is airborne." That was the last I heard from her. The call dropped, and I couldn't get through again. I spent that night reviewing all my notes, connecting the wildlife behavioral changes to what I was now seeing in humans. The animals knew something was coming. They sensed the danger before we did. Just like they can sense an approaching tornado or earthquake, they detected this threat while we remained oblivious. I made a decision then to document everything from a scientific perspective. If this was spreading as fast as it seemed, someone would need to understand how it worked. My training in wildlife biology, especially predator behavior, might give me insights others wouldn't have. The next morning, I headed into Riverdale for supplies, figuring it might be my last chance before things got worse. The town was in the early stages of panic. Some stores were already closed. Others had lines out the door. The pharmacy was being emptied by desperate people stocking up on medications. At the town center, I saw my first group of infected. 3 individuals with the same appearance as Jim Henderson. They moved with purpose, those unnatural whispers passing between them as they stalked a woman trying to get to her car. I watched in horror as they seemed to communicate complex strategies, one blocking her path while the others circled around. That's when I realized what I was seeing: pack-hunting behavior in humans. Just like wolves, just like what I'd studied for years. I managed to create a distraction by triggering a car alarm, which gave the woman time to escape. The infected turned their attention toward the noise, communicating rapidly in those whispers. I used the opportunity to gather what supplies I could from the nearby market before things deteriorated further. As I was leaving town, I passed the gas station on the edge of Riverdale and noticed the Miller family, parents and 2 children, trapped in their car surrounded by 5 infected. They were clearly coordinating an attack, taking positions around all exits of the vehicle. Without thinking, I used what I knew about disrupting predator behavior. I drove toward the group, horn blaring, which scattered them temporarily. Predators instinctively avoid loud, approaching threats. It gave me just enough time to pull alongside the Miller's car and tell them to follow me. We made it out, but just barely. The infected were already regrouping as we sped away, those whispers growing louder as more joined their hunting party. I led the Millers to a side road and gave them directions to the emergency management center that was being established at the high school, according to radio broadcasts. I decided against going there myself. Too many people in one place seemed like a recipe for disaster if the infection was truly airborne. Instead, I returned to my field station with a new purpose: to understand exactly what we were facing and how to survive it. The wildlife behaviors I'd been documenting weren't just coincidental to the outbreak. They were the first warning signs of an ecosystem sensing disruption. And now, ironically, humans were becoming part of that same predator-prey dynamic. I spent that second night listening to the emergency broadcasts as they became increasingly dire. Reports of infections spreading exponentially. Hospitals overwhelmed. First mentions of military involvement. And, outside my cabin, the sounds of whispers growing ever closer as darkness fell. That night at my field station was one of the longest of my life. I barricaded the doors and windows, but those whispers outside kept getting closer. I kept thinking about what I'd seen at the Henderson farm, trying to process it scientifically rather than emotionally. That's always been my approach: observe, document, analyze. But there was nothing in my training that prepared me for this. Let me explain more about the Henderson farm visit, because that's when I first understood we were dealing with something unprecedented. When I arrived that morning, I immediately noticed the equipment abandoned in the fields. Jim's John Deere tractor was still idling with the driver's seat empty. Tools were scattered around as if dropped mid-use. The livestock pens were open, but the animals were gone, either escaped or something worse. The farm was eerily silent. In my years of wildlife work, I've developed a sensitivity to natural sounds. Every ecosystem has its background noise: birds, insects, the rustle of vegetation. But at the Hendersons, there was nothing. Complete bioacoustic silence. In nature, that only happens when a major predator enters the area. I remember calling out for Jim repeatedly, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in that silence. When I approached the farmhouse and found the door open, all my instincts told me to leave, but professional responsibility pushed me forward. Inside, the scene was disturbing in its ordinariness. Half-filled coffee cups on the table, a newspaper open to the weather forecast. Margaret's reading glasses neatly folded beside her chair. But there were subtle signs of disturbance: a knocked-over salt shaker, a chair pushed back too quickly. The refrigerator door was open slightly, leaking cold air. I called out again, and that's when I heard a sound from the barn, that wet, raspy breathing I mentioned before. Something between a wheeze and a whisper. The barn door was partially open. I remember hesitating, then pulling out my flashlight even though it was daytime. That's how wrong everything felt. "Jim!" It's Zeke Harding from Wildlife Services. "Everything okay out here?" The breathing sound stopped momentarily. Then I heard movement. Not the usual heavy footsteps of a farmer in work boots, but something more fluid. Predatory. I found him in the back stall where they kept their prize bull, which was now nowhere to be seen. Jim was standing perfectly still, his back to me. His clothes were stained with something dark that I initially thought was mud or manure. "Jim, you called about your cattle?" When he turned, I nearly dropped my flashlight. His face had that grayish pallor I described, but it was more than that. His movements were wrong. Too smooth, too controlled for a man in his 60s with a bad hip. His eyes locked onto me with predatory focus, pupils so dilated they looked black in the dim barn light. The veins under his skin were visibly darker, pushing against the surface like they were trying to break through. And when he opened his mouth, instead of words, that whispering sound emerged, sibilant, almost like static but with patterns to it. Intentional communication. I backed away, maintaining eye contact. You never turn your back on a predator. That's basic wildlife safety. Jim moved toward me with that unnatural smoothness. Not running, not lunging, but advancing with absolute confidence, like a wolf that knows its prey can't escape. I kept backing up until I hit the barn door, then turned to run. That's when I saw Margaret emerging from behind the corn crib. Her appearance matched Jim's completely. Same gray skin, same distended veins, same dilated eyes. And the moment she saw Jim pursuing me, they began exchanging those whispers. What happened next confirmed my worst fears. They didn't both chase me directly. Instead, Margaret immediately moved to circle around the side of the barn, cutting off my path to my truck, while Jim continued his direct pursuit. Classic flanking maneuver, pack hunting behavior. I sprinted to my vehicle, barely making it inside before Jim reached me. His hand slapped against the window as I locked the doors. Margaret was already approaching from the other side. They weren't frenzied or mindless. They were methodical, coordinated. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of Jim's face pressed against the glass. There was nothing human in his expression anymore. No recognition, no anger, not even hunger. Just cold, calculating predatory intent. I reversed quickly, nearly hitting Margaret, then sped down the gravel driveway. In my rearview mirror, I saw them both standing side by side, watching me leave. Not giving chase, but whispering to each other. I realized now they were probably communicating my description, my vehicle details, to others of their kind. When I tried calling the sheriff's department from the road, I got through briefly to Deputy Collins, who sounded overwhelmed. "We've got similar reports from all over the county," he said. "People acting strange, becoming violent. Hospitals calling it some kind of rabies-like outbreak. Health departments being called in." "This isn't rabies," I told him. "I've dealt with rabid animals. This is something completely different. These people are coordinating their attacks. They're communicating. Look, just stay where you are. We're setting up an emergency response center at the high school. CDC's been notified." Then the call dropped, and I couldn't get a signal again. I considered going to the high school, but something told me large gatherings would be dangerous. Instead, I drove back to my field station to gather my research and equipment. If this was connected to those fungal samples I'd sent Dr. Chen, I needed to understand how. I tried calling her multiple times before finally getting through. The connection was poor, but her fear came through clearly. "The samples you sent are unlike anything in our database," she said, her voice shaking. "The spores have a unique dispersal mechanism. They become airborne when the humidity and temperature hit certain thresholds." "Like what we've been having for the past 3 weeks," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "Exactly. And Zeke, the spores don't just infect, they transform. They're rewiring neural pathways, creating new connections. My assistant was exposed yesterday when a sample container cracked. His transformation was rapid. Increased strength, decreased verbal communication, but increased sensitivity to sound and movement. They've quarantined the entire biology building. I'm locked in my lab." The call cut out after that. I tried her number repeatedly but couldn't reconnect. That night, I reviewed everything I knew about fungal infections and behavior modification in nature. There are precedents. The cordyceps fungus that turns ants into zombies, forcing them to climb to ideal spore dispersal locations before killing them. But nothing on this scale. nothing that could affect humans so dramatically. I checked all my wildlife survey data from the past month, looking for patterns I might have missed. The mapping was clear. Animals had been avoiding certain areas, particularly low-lying humid regions where I'd later found the fungal growths. They sensed the danger before we did. By morning, the local radio station was broadcasting emergency instructions. The announcer's voice was tense, professional, but I could hear the fear underneath. The CDC has confirmed an outbreak of an unknown pathogen in Riverdale County. Residents are advised to stay indoors, avoid contact with infected individuals, and await further instructions. Symptoms include gray discoloration of the skin, disorientation, and loss of verbal communication skills. If you or someone in your household exhibits these symptoms, isolate them immediately and contact emergency services. The broadcast then listed the emergency shelter locations, including the high school gym and the community center downtown. I knew instinctively these would become infection hotspots. I decided to head into Riverdale one last time for supplies before the situation deteriorated further. I needed medications, food, water purification tablets, and communications equipment if possible. My training had taught me to prepare for extended field research in isolated conditions. Now, those skills would be used for survival. Riverdale was already transforming when I arrived early that morning. The small town of about 5,000 people was in the early stages of panic. The grocery store parking lot was packed, people loading their vehicles with supplies. Some were wearing masks, ineffective against fungal spores, but they couldn't have known that. Main Street showed the division in how people were responding. Some businesses were closed with handwritten signs saying, "Family emergency," or simply, "Closed until further notice." Others were operating as if nothing was happening. The diners still had customers inside, elderly men at their regular table discussing the news. As I parked near the pharmacy, I saw my first group of infected in town. 3 individuals stood motionless at the intersection, those whispered communications passing between them. Their clothing suggested different occupations, one in mechanic's coveralls, another in what had been a police uniform, the third in medical scrubs. The infection didn't discriminate. What struck me was their behavior. They weren't wandering aimlessly or attacking randomly. They were stationed strategically at the intersection, watching, waiting. When a woman emerged from the bank across the street, their posture immediately changed. Alert, focused. I watched in horror as they implemented what I can only describe as a coordinated hunting strategy. One moved directly toward her, while the others circled to cut off escape routes. Their whispers increased in tempo and complexity. The woman noticed too late. She froze momentarily, then ran toward her car. The infected adjusted their approach instantly, one changing direction to intercept her. That's when I intervened, triggering a car alarm with my key fob from across the street. The sudden noise disrupted their focus, another behavior I recognized from predator research. The momentary distraction gave the woman time to reach her vehicle and drive away. The infected quickly regrouped, those whispers passing between them again. Then, most disturbingly, all 3 turned in my direction. They hadn't seen me. I was sure of that. But somehow, they'd identified the source of the disruption. I ducked into the pharmacy before they could approach, my heart pounding. Inside, people were grabbing medications frantically while a single pharmacist tried to maintain order. I quickly gathered antibiotics, pain relievers, and first aid supplies, though I doubted conventional medications would help against this infection. As I was gathering supplies in the pharmacy, the radio behind the counter was broadcasting emergency updates. The infection had spread to neighboring counties. The announcer mentioned respiratory precautions, but said nothing about fungal spores. They didn't understand what they were dealing with yet. I grabbed as many N95 masks as I could find knowing they might offer minimal protection against spores. The pharmacy was nearly picked clean already, shelves emptied of everything useful. People were panicking, but still following social rules, waiting in line, paying for items. That wouldn't last much longer. When I stepped outside again, the infected from the intersection were gone, but the streets had changed in just those few minutes. More people were rushing to their cars, some already wearing masks. A National Guard truck rolled past, heading toward the high school. That meant government response was ramping up, but I feared it was already too late. I made my way to the general store for food supplies. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Fewer customers, more focused on essentials. The owner, Carl Branson, recognized me from my wildlife work. "Zeke, what the hell is happening?" he asked, voice low as he helped me gather canned goods. "They're saying it's some kind of virus, but I saw the Peterson family this morning and they weren't sick. They were something else." "It's not a virus," I told him, keeping my voice down. "It's fungal, and it's airborne. Those masks won't help much. You need to get somewhere with filtered air if possible." His face paled. "My sister's place in Grand Island has one of those fancy air purifiers for her allergies. Think that would work?" "Better than nothing. Go soon, before they block the roads." As we spoke, I noticed a woman in the canned food aisle watching us too intently. Her skin hadn't grayed yet, but her eyes were different, pupils slightly too dilated. Early-stage infection. "Don't look now," I murmured. "But we need to leave. The woman in the blue jacket, she's turning." Carl glanced over despite my warning and froze. "Mary Winters. Her husband works at the hospital. She was fine yesterday. The transformation happens fast. Let's go." We moved toward the exit, but Mary began that whispering, soft at first, then louder, like she was calling for others. Carl and I hurried outside just as two more infected rounded the corner responding to her call. "My truck's across the street," Carl said. "You? 2 blocks down. I'll be fine. Go to your sister's. Now." He hesitated only a moment before nodding and rushing toward his vehicle. I moved in the opposite direction, trying to appear casual despite the adrenaline flooding my system. The infected were primarily triggered by rapid movement, another predatory trait. I was halfway to my truck when I heard more whispers from an alley between buildings. I slowed my pace, scanning for threats. That's when I saw the Miller family again, the ones I'd helped at the gas station yesterday. They were huddled behind a dumpster, the parents protectively sheltering their 2 children. Mr. Miller recognized me and waved urgently. I approached cautiously. "The evacuation center is overrun," he whispered. "We were almost there when we saw people attacking the National Guard. Dozens of infected just swarmed them. We've been hiding since." Mrs. Miller was pale with fear. "Our car was blocked in. We had to leave it. Please, can you help us?" I couldn't just leave them. "My truck's not far. Stay close. Move slowly. If you see any infected, don't run unless I say so. Running triggers their hunting instinct." We moved as a group, the parents each carrying a child. Main Street was emptier now, most people either gone or hiding. But the whispers were everywhere, from inside buildings, around corners, sometimes seemingly from empty space. The infected were communicating across distances, creating a network of awareness. We were a block from my truck when 3 infected appeared ahead of us. They moved with that same fluid grace I'd observed before, immediately shifting to intercept us. "Walk naturally toward that hardware store," I instructed the family quietly. "Don't look directly at them. Predators key on eye contact." We changed course smoothly, but the infected adjusted their approach. They were herding us away from my truck. I realized we needed a distraction again. The hardware store was closed but had a display of garden equipment outside. I casually picked up a battery-operated leaf blower as we passed. When I say go, walk quickly to my truck. Don't run. It's the Green Forest Service pickup. The infected were closing in, their whispers increasing in tempo. I turned on the leaf blower to its highest setting and threw it in the opposite direction. The sudden mechanical noise disrupted their focus, buying us precious seconds. Go now! The Millers moved quickly while the infected momentarily tracked the noise. We reached my truck and piled in, the children in back with Mrs. Miller while Mr. Miller took the passenger seat. I started the engine just as the infected realized the deception and changed direction toward us. "Where can we take you?" I asked as we pulled away. "My brother has a hunting cabin near Beaver Creek," Mr. Miller said. "Isolated, well-stocked. We were trying to reach it when everything went bad. I know the area. I can get you close, but then I need to continue my research." Mrs. Miller looked at me strangely. "Research? What research?" "I'm documenting everything about this infection. How it spreads, how the infected behave, their weaknesses. Someone needs to understand what's happening if we're going to survive." I drove them through increasingly chaotic streets. More infected were appearing, some still in transition, their skin just beginning to gray, movements becoming more fluid. The whispering was everywhere now, creating a background noise that set my teeth on edge. We passed the hospital, which was clearly overwhelmed. Ambulances were backed up at the emergency entrance. Medical staff in protective gear were trying to maintain order, but patients were streaming in faster than they could be processed. Some already showed signs of infection. That's where it would have started spreading exponentially, I told the Millers. Confined spaces, many people in close proximity, recirculated air. Mr. Miller nodded grimly. "Tom works there, Mary's husband. He called yesterday saying patients were coming in with strange symptoms. High fever, confusion, then that gray skin. Said they were whispering to each other." That confirmed my theory about progression. First respiratory symptoms as the spores take hold, then neurological changes, finally physical transformation. The whispering starts when they begin coordinating with others. It's a communication system. We had to detour around several roadblocks, some established by authorities, others by abandoned vehicles or small crashes. The infected seemed to be using these obstacles strategically, creating bottlenecks where they could trap people. As we neared the edge of town, we encountered a military checkpoint. National Guard troops were scanning IDs and checking people for symptoms before allowing them through. A line of vehicles stretched ahead of us. "This isn't good," I said quietly. "Too many people in one place." As if confirming my fears, whispers began to rise from multiple directions. The soldiers noticed too, becoming more alert, weapons ready. That's when I saw them, infected emerging from buildings and alleys, moving with coordinated purpose toward the checkpoint. Not attacking immediately, but positioning themselves. Waiting. "They're hunting as a pack," I told the Millers. "We need another route." I backed up carefully, turning down a side street before the soldiers noticed us leaving. Behind us, shouts erupted as the infected finally moved in. I didn't look back. We took farm roads and logging tracks to reach the area near Beaver Creek. The Millers' relief was palpable when they recognized familiar landmarks. "The cabin's 2 miles up that dirt road," Mr. Miller said, pointing. "We can walk from here if you need to go." I considered my options. My research station had more of my equipment and notes, but it wasn't as defensible as a proper cabin might be. "I'll make sure you get there safely first." The cabin was well positioned on a small rise, with good visibility in all directions. It was sturdy, with metal shutters that could be closed over the windows. Mr. Miller's brother was a survival enthusiast, it seemed. After helping them settle in and sharing what information I had about the infection, I prepared to leave. Mrs. Miller tried to convince me to stay. "It's not safe out there alone," she said. "I need to continue documenting this," I told her. "My background gives me insights others might not have. That information could help more people survive." Before leaving, I gave them my field radio frequency. "I'll check in daily if I can. If you hear whispers nearby, don't make any sudden moves or loud noises. They hunt based on sound and motion." As I drove back toward my research station, I kept thinking about what I'd observed of the infected behavior. Their coordination was becoming more sophisticated by the hour. They were adapting, evolving their strategies, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were learning from each encounter. The road back was eerily empty. No vehicles, no people. Just occasional glimpses of wildlife fleeing through the trees. They were still avoiding the infected areas instinctively. I made mental notes of where animals were present and where they weren't. The absence of wildlife was becoming a reliable indicator of infected activity. When I reached my station, I immediately secured the perimeter and began organizing my observations. The behavioral patterns were clear now. The infected were operating as a coordinated hunting unit, using strategies familiar to anyone who studied apex predators. But their communication system was evolving beyond anything I'd seen in nature. I spent that night documenting everything, reviewing my wildlife survey maps against reported infection clusters. The correlation was unmistakable. Animals had been avoiding the initial fungal growth areas weeks before human infections began. If we'd recognized the warning signs, perhaps we could have contained this. Outside, the whispers grew louder as darkness fell. They knew I was here. They were waiting. I spent that night at my research station analyzing everything I'd observed about the infected. Their behavior wasn't random. It followed predictable patterns if you understood predator-prey dynamics. I compiled my notes systematically, starting with the first observations of unusual wildlife behavior 3 weeks earlier. The connections were clear when viewed chronologically. First, animals avoided certain areas, particularly those low-lying, humid sections of the valley where I later found the fungal growths. Then came the strange behaviors in livestock and domestic animals. Finally, human infections began appearing, starting with people who worked outdoors. Farmers, maintenance workers, construction crews. Using my topographical maps, I marked all the locations where I documented unusual fungal growth. They formed a pattern following water drainage from higher elevations, suggesting the spores had been carried by recent rainfall into these collection areas where they proliferated in the warm, humid conditions. The animal migration patterns I'd recorded showed clear avoidance of these same areas. Nature had been warning us, but we didn't understand the message. I turned to analyzing the infected behavior next. From what I'd observed, the transformation progressed through distinct stages. Stage 1 began with respiratory symptoms as spores were inhaled: fever, disorientation, confusion. This phase lasted approximately 8 to 12 hours based on the cases I'd witnessed. Stage 2 involved visible physical changes: graying skin, dilated pupils, and prominence of veins beneath the skin. Motor control became more fluid, predatory. Speech capability diminished, replaced by the beginning of those whispered communications. This phase seemed to last another 8 to 12 hours. Stage 3 was full transformation, complete coordination with other infected complex pack-hunting behaviors, and sophisticated use of whispered communication across distances. No remaining human behaviors or recognition. Most concerning was how quickly they were adapting. The infected I'd encountered at the Henderson farm showed basic pack coordination. By the time I saw them in Riverdale, they were implementing complex ambush strategies, and at the military checkpoint, they demonstrated tactical assessment and patience, waiting for optimal moment to attack. They were learning, evolving their strategies based on successes and failures. I examined my field microscope samples of the fungal spores I'd collected. Even with my limited equipment, I could see they were unlike anything in my reference materials. Their structure seemed designed for airborne transmission, with specialized filaments that would easily become aerosolized when mature. What Dr. Chen had told me made sense. The fungus was likely affecting the neural pathways in infected hosts, rewiring connections to create this new behavior set. The whispers were a novel communication system developed to coordinate hunting. But why hunting? Most pathogens simply reproduce and spread. This one was actively changing host behavior in specific ways that facilitated predation. It wasn't just spreading through victims. It was using them to acquire more hosts. I recalled research on toxoplasmosis in rats, how the parasite modified rodent behavior to make them attracted to cat urine instead of fearful, increasing chances of the rat being eaten and the parasite completing its life cycle in the cat. This seemed similar, but far more sophisticated. My equipment wasn't sufficient for deeper analysis, but I theorized that the fungus required certain proteins or nutrients found in living human tissue to complete some phase of its life cycle. It was using infected hosts to acquire uninfected ones as a food source, not just as new vessels for reproduction. That theory would explain the predatory behavior rather than simple mindless aggression. It would also explain why infected didn't seem to attack each other. They recognized the fungal signature in others of their kind. I needed to find a way to test this theory. If correct, it might suggest potential weaknesses in the infected behavior patterns that could be exploited for survival. With dawn approaching, I turned to practical matters. If spores were the primary transmission vector, protection against airborne particles was crucial. The Anti-N95 masks I'd acquired would provide limited defense but weren't sufficient for prolonged exposure. I needed better filtration. Looking around my research station, I assessed available materials. I had several high-grade HEPA filters used for collecting air samples in wildlife habitats. Combined with the masks and sealed properly, they might create more effective protection. I spent the early morning hours modifying the masks, using silicone sealant from my equipment repair kit, to improve the facial seal and attaching miniature HEPA filters to create a more effective breathing apparatus. It was makeshift but better than standard masks alone. Next, I needed to understand how environmental factors affected spore viability. Dr. Chen had mentioned humidity and temperature as activation factors. My weather station data showed the unusually warm, humid conditions had persisted for weeks before infections began appearing. If temperature and humidity were critical factors, perhaps extreme conditions in either direction would reduce spore viability. Cold, dry air might render them dormant or destroy them completely. It was a theory worth testing once I had proper equipment. The emergency radio broadcasts had become less frequent overnight. The last update mentioned military quarantine zones being established around affected areas and advised people to remain indoors. Nothing about fungal pathogens or airborne transmission. They still hadn't identified the true nature of the threat. I needed to find a facility with better research equipment. The community college in Riverdale had a decent biology lab, but venturing back into town would be extremely dangerous now. The university where Dr. Chen worked was in Lincoln, over 100 miles away, and likely overrun already. The nearest viable option was the veterinary clinic on Route 16, about 15 miles from my position. It would have basic laboratory equipment, microscopes, possibly even centrifuges and other tools I could use for more detailed analysis. I gathered essential supplies, including my improvised masks, field notes, and sample collection equipment. The infected had been active around my station during the night, their whispers occasionally audible through the walls, but seemed to have moved on by morning. Still, I scanned the surroundings carefully before venturing out. The morning air was heavy with moisture, fog clinging to low areas, perfect conditions for spore activation and transmission. I wore my modified mask as I loaded my truck, then checked the radio one last time before departing. The broadcast was different. A military spokesman had replaced the local emergency management team. "This is Colonel James Mercer of the United States Army. By executive order, the following counties are under full quarantine: Riverdale, Jefferson, Franklin, and Westmoreland. No one is permitted to enter or exit these areas. Military checkpoints have been established on all major roads. Citizens are ordered to remain in their homes until further notice. Anyone attempting to breach quarantine will be detained. This is not a civilian emergency. This is a matter of national security." The mention of national security confirmed my fears. The government recognized this wasn't a conventional pathogen, but the quarantine approach suggested they still didn't understand its airborne nature. Containing geographic areas wouldn't stop spore transmission through air currents. I plotted a route to the veterinary clinic using logging roads and fire breaks to avoid military checkpoints. My Forest Service truck would attract less attention on these back routes. The landscape had changed subtly since yesterday. Wildlife was almost completely absent now. No birds called, no squirrels moved through the trees. The natural world had gone silent in a way that was profoundly disturbing to someone trained to read ecosystem health through bioacoustic signatures. Halfway to the clinic, I encountered a roadblock, not military, but civilian. 3 pickup trucks parked across the logging road, men with hunting rifles standing guard. I slowed to a stop at a safe distance and rolled down my window just enough to communicate. "Forest Service," I called out, pointing to my truck's insignia. "I'm conducting emergency wildlife assessment." One man approached cautiously, rifle at the ready. He was middle-aged, dressed in hunting gear, with the weathered face of someone who spent time outdoors. "No government officials allowed through," he said. "We've secured this area for our families." "I'm not with the containment operation," I explained. "I'm a wildlife officer studying the infection, trying to understand how it spreads and how to stop it." He studied me suspiciously. "You infected?" "Number and I know more about this than most. It's fungal, not viral. Spreads through airborne spores. Those military masks won't help much." That got his attention. "How do you know that?" "I found the fungal growths 3 weeks ago. Sent samples to the university for analysis. I've been tracking the spread pattern through wildlife behavior changes." He considered this, then gestured to my mask. "That thing protect you?" "Better than standard masks. I modified it with HEPA filters. I'm heading to the vet clinic to use their lab equipment for further research." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded to his companions. "Let him through. But you share what you learn, understand? We've got children here." "I will. One piece of advice. The infected hunt based on sound and movement. They communicate to coordinate attacks. If they find you, stay quiet and still until you have a clear escape route." He nodded grimly. "Appreciate the tip. Roads clear to the junction, but don't take Route 16 directly. Military's got it blocked at the bridge. Take the fire road that runs parallel, comes out behind the strip mall." I thanked him and continued on, following his directions. The encounter left me thinking about how quickly social structures were adapting to the crisis. New communities forming based on survival needs rather than previous social connections. I reached the veterinary clinic just before noon. The building appeared deserted, parking lot empty except for one abandoned car. The front door was locked, but a side entrance had been forced open, likely by someone seeking medical supplies. After checking carefully for signs of infected, I entered with caution. The interior was mostly intact, some drawers open, certain supplies missing, but the equipment I needed remained. The power was still on, running on the building's emergency generator. I set up a makeshift lab using the veterinary equipment, preparing slides from my fungal samples for closer examination under their more powerful microscope. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The fungal structure was unlike anything in scientific literature. The spores contained complex internal structures that resembled neural networks in miniature. They weren't just reproductive units, they were carriers of information, programmed to hijack host nervous systems in specific ways. Most disturbing was how the fungal filaments interfaced with human tissue. In samples I'd taken from infected blood at the Henderson farm, the fungal structures weren't simply invading cells, they were integrating with them, creating hybrid cellular networks that explained the rapid neural rewiring in victims. This wasn't random mutation. The complexity and specificity of the structures suggested deliberate design. Whether through accelerated evolution or something more troubling, this pathogen had been optimized to transform human hosts into coordinated hunting units. As I documented my findings, I heard the first whispers from outside the building. The infected had found me. The whispers outside the veterinary clinic grew louder. Multiple infected coordinating, positioning themselves around the building. I quickly gathered my notes and essential equipment, knowing I couldn't stay. The microscope had confirmed my suspicions about the fungal pathogen, but I needed to get that information somewhere safe. Through the small window in the lab area, I could see 4 infected moving with that disturbing fluid grace around the parking lot. They weren't rushing, weren't frenzied. They were setting up containment positions, cutting off the potential escape routes. Their whispered communications had a rhythm now, almost like a language. I had maybe minutes before they found a way in. The side door I'd entered through was still open, but 2 infected were already positioned near it. The front entrance was being watched by another. The 4th was circling toward the back of the building. I recalled the building layout I'd seen when entering. There was a loading dock for deliveries at the rear. If I could reach it before the 4th infected got into position, I might have a chance. Moving silently through the clinic, I collected my samples and notes, securing them in my pack. I left the microscope slides. They were too fragile to transport safely, and I documented my observations thoroughly. The rear hallway led past treatment rooms to the small loading area. I could hear whispers outside growing more insistent as I approached the delivery door. Looking through its small window, I saw the loading dock was clear for the moment, but the 4th infected was approaching from the far side of the parking lot. I needed a distraction. In one of the treatment rooms, I found an electronic thermometer with an alarm function. Setting it to trigger in 30 seconds, I placed it in a metal cabinet and partially closed the door. It would create a loud, sustained beep when activated. When the alarm sounded, the whispers outside immediately changed pitch and tempo. Through the window, I saw all 4 infected turn towards the front of the building, moving with predatory focus toward the sound. I pushed open the loading dock door as quietly as possible and slipped outside. My truck was still at the front of the building, unreachable now. I'd have to proceed on foot until I could find another vehicle. Behind the clinic was a wooded area leading toward residential streets. I moved into the tree line, using skills honed through years of wildlife tracking to move silently across the forest floor. The infected had exceptional hearing. Any snapped twig or rustled leaves would draw their attention. From the tree line, I watched as the infected systematically searched the clinic building. Their coordination was even more advanced than what I'd seen in town yesterday. They cleared rooms in pairs, one entering while the other secured the exit. Military-style search patterns. This suggested they were incorporating knowledge from recently turned victims, possibly some of the National Guard troops from the checkpoint. When they found no prey inside, they emerged and began expanding their search perimeter. I retreated deeper into the woods, moving parallel to the residential area rather than directly into it. Houses would offer temporary shelter, but could become traps if surrounded. After about a mile of careful movement through the forest, I reached a residential back road. The neighborhood seemed deserted. No people visible, several houses with doors left open in hasty evacuation. I needed transportation and supplies if I was going to continue my research. A blue sedan was parked in one driveway, keys still in the ignition. The owners had likely fled in another vehicle or with neighbors. I checked inside for infected before approaching. The car was clear. As I drove carefully through back roads, I monitored the emergency radio frequencies. The military broadcasts had become more frequent, but less informative. Repeated instructions to remain indoors, assurances that the situation was being contained, warnings that quarantine enforcement was in effect. Then I picked up a different transmission, weaker, on an alternate emergency channel. "This is Dr. Sarah Okafor at Riverdale General Hospital. If anyone can hear this, the hospital has been compromised. We've lost the East Wing entirely. The infection is spreading through air circulation systems. It's not contact-based. Repeat, not contact-based. It's airborne. Standard masks are ineffective. We need evacuation for remaining uninfected staff and patients." I immediately changed course toward the hospital. Dr. Okafor clearly understood what we were facing, and medical personnel with that knowledge would be invaluable. Plus, the hospital would have better research facilities than the vet clinic if any remained intact. Approaching Riverdale General required extreme caution. The hospital was on the edge of town, a sprawling complex of connected buildings. Even from several blocks away, I could see it was partially overrun. Ambulances were abandoned at haphazard angles near the emergency entrance. Military vehicles formed a perimeter, but there were no soldiers visible. I parked at a distance and observed through binoculars. The East Wing, as Dr. Okafor had reported, showed clear signs of infected activity. Figures moved past windows with that distinctive fluid motion. Other sections appeared intact, with lights still functioning. The emergency broadcast repeated at irregular intervals. Dr. Okafor was likely using a portable radio, transmitting whenever she could safely do so. I needed to find a way to contact her directly before attempting to reach the hospital. I tuned to the same frequency and transmitted, "Dr. Okafor, this is Ezekiel Harding, Wildlife Conservation Officer. I've been studying the fungal pathogen. Can you advise on safest approach to your location?" "Over." After several tense minutes, a response came. "Mr. Harding, we're barricaded in the Western Laboratory Wing, 3rd floor. Main entrances are compromised. Service entrance near the loading dock is still secure but won't be for long. We have 15 uninfected people here. How soon can you reach us?" "Over." "I'm alone with limited resources," I replied, "not equipped for mass evacuation. But I have research data on the pathogen that might help. What's your situation with infected?" "Over." "They're systematic," she responded. "Clearing sections methodically. They seem to be centrally coordinated somehow. We have maybe 2 hours before they breach our location. If you're coming, use the service stairs at the northwest corner. We've secured the 3rd floor access." "Over." I considered my options. Entering the hospital was extremely high risk, but the potential value of connecting with medical professionals who understood the threat was significant. Dr. Okafor's group might have crucial information I lacked. "I'll approach from northwest side," I transmitted. "ETA 30 minutes. Be ready to provide cover if needed." "Over." I drove closer using side streets, parking several blocks from the hospital in a location that provided multiple escape routes. Gathering my research notes and improvised protective gear, I approached on foot, staying low and using vehicles and landscaping for cover. The hospital grounds were eerily quiet despite the clear signs of chaos. Abandoned vehicles, scattered medical equipment, occasional dark stains on the pavement. The infected weren't visible outside, which concerned me more than if they had been. They were indoors, hunting methodically. I reached the northwest corner service entrance without incident, which itself was suspicious. The door was ajar, the electronic security lock disabled. Inside was a service corridor lined with laundry carts and maintenance equipment. I moved silently, listening for whispers. The stairwell was at the end of the corridor, a plain metal door with a small window. Through it, I could see the stairs were clear up to the first landing. I entered cautiously, weapon ready, and began ascending. Between the second and third floors, I heard them, whispers echoing in the stairwell from somewhere above. Multiple infected communicating rapidly. I froze, controlling my breathing. The voices seemed to be on the fourth floor or higher, not immediately threatening. I continued to the third floor and found the door as Dr. Okafor had described, barricaded from the inside with a small viewing port. I knocked softly in the pattern of 313. After a moment, the viewing port opened and eyes peered out. "Identify yourself," a female voice demanded. "Ezekiel Harding, Wildlife Service." Dr. Okafor requested my approach. The barricade was partially moved, creating just enough space for me to slip through. Inside were 4 people. A woman in a doctor's coat who introduced herself as Sarah Okafor, an older man in security uniform, and 2 nurses. "The others are in the main lab," Dr. Okafor explained as they resecured the door. "We rotate watch duty. Come, we don't have much time." She led me down a hallway to what had been a medical research laboratory. Inside, 11 more people were organized in what had clearly become a temporary survival center. Medical supplies were organized on tables, makeshift beds arranged in one corner, an area designated for food and water. "This is Mr. Harding," Dr. Okafor announced. "He's been researching the pathogen." A young man in army fatigues approached, clearly military but not in full uniform. "Staff Sergeant Darnell Washington, 2nd Infantry Division. We were deployed for quarantine operations before everything went to hell. Are you with any government response team?" "No," I replied. "I'm a wildlife conservation officer. I discovered the fungal growths 3 weeks ago during routine surveys. I've been tracking the spread pattern through changes in animal behavior and documenting infected human behavior patterns." Dr. Okafor's expression sharpened with interest. "Fungal. We suspected as much from tissue samples, but our analysis was interrupted when the east wing fell. What else do you know?" I quickly summarized my observations: the spore transmission method, the progression through infection stages, the increasingly coordinated hunting behavior, and my theories about neural rewiring based on microscopic examination. "That matches what we've seen," she confirmed. "The transformation affects the limbic system first, then motor control centers, then higher cognitive functions, but not in a degenerative way, more like a repurposing. And the whispers. We've recorded and analyzed them. There are distinct patterns, consistent across different infected groups." Washington added, "The military knew it was airborne. That's why they tried bombing the heaviest infection zones yesterday, thought they could incinerate the spores. Instead, they just created a massive dispersal event, accelerated the spread tenfold. That explained the sudden increase in infected I'd observed." "Where did they bomb?" "The warehouse district on the east side," he replied. "Initial infection concentration was highest there according to our intelligence. CDC identified it as Ground Zero. That aligned with my wildlife behavior maps, the area where animals had first begun avoiding weeks ago, near where I'd found the earliest fungal growths." Dr. Okafor led me to their laboratory setup. "We've been testing different treatments, but nothing stops the progression once symptoms begin. The fungal structures integrate with neural tissue too quickly and completely. What about preventative measures? I asked. Have you identified any factors that inhibit spore viability? Limited testing suggests extreme cold renders spores dormant, she said. UV light destroys them if exposure is prolonged. But practical application of either approach is challenging, given our circumstances. This information confirmed my theories about environmental factors. My wildlife surveys indicated animals avoided low-lying areas with poor air circulation first. Higher elevations with more UV exposure and better air movement might have lower spore concentration. Washington nodded thoughtfully. That tracks with our infection distribution data. Lower rates in hillside neighborhoods, highest in valley areas. We need to consolidate our research, Dr. Okafor decided. Compare notes systematically. Perhaps together we can develop more effective protective measures, maybe even identify weaknesses in the infected behavior patterns. Before we could continue, one of the nurses monitoring the hallway cameras called urgently. Movement on the second floor. Multiple infected approaching the northwest stairwell. Washington checked his weapon. They've found our access point. We need to move to contingency location. Contingency location? I asked. Roof access to the western wing, Dr. Okafor explained quickly. We've prepared emergency supplies there. Helicopter landing pad, if evacuation ever becomes possible. How many infected? Washington asked the nurse. At least 8 that I can see. Moving in formation. They'll reach our floor in minutes. I shared what I knew. They hunt as coordinated units. If they're moving in formation, they know exactly where we are. Someone's directing them. Washington took immediate command of the situation. Everyone grab your designated emergency packs. 2 minutes to evacuation. Maya, Eli, help Dr. Jensen with the medical supplies. I noticed the teenagers he addressed. Maya appeared about 16, her brother Eli perhaps 14. They moved with practiced efficiency, helping an elderly doctor secure critical medications in a transport case. We need to create a diversion, I suggested, thinking of how the infected responded to sound. Something to draw them away from our evacuation route. Dr. Okafor nodded. The Eastern Corridor has an automated alert system we could trigger remotely. It would sound alarms throughout that section. Do it, Washington ordered. Set it for delayed activation. Give us time to reach the roof access first. As the group gathered supplies, I helped Dr. Okafor access the hospital's security system. She quickly navigated through the interface, programming the Eastern Wing alarms to trigger 3 minutes after activation. Ready, she confirmed, finger poised over the execute command. On your signal. Washington did a final head count. Everyone stay together. Move quickly but quietly. No heroics. If someone falls behind, they stay behind. Harsh, but necessary. I remembered the whispers I'd heard in the stairwell. We can't use the same stairs they're ascending. Is there another route? Service elevator shaft, Washington said. Elevator's non-functional, but there's a maintenance ladder inside the shaft. It's how we've been moving between floors without using the main stairwells. He led our group down a side corridor to what looked like a utility closet. Inside was access to the elevator shaft. The doors already pried open and secured. A metal ladder ran along the wall of the shaft. Dr. Okafor, trigger the diversion now, Washington instructed. Everyone up the ladder to the roof. Move. She pressed the execute command, and we began ascending the maintenance ladder one by one. The shaft was dark, illuminated only by emergency lighting. I counted 15 people, including myself, medical staff, a few patients who could travel, Washington, and the 2 teenagers. We climbed in tense silence, listening for any sounds of pursuit. About halfway up, we heard the distant alarms begin in the Eastern Wing. Almost immediately, The whispers below changed, became more urgent, directed. The infected were responding to the diversion. "It's working," Washington whispered as we continued climbing. "They're redirecting." We reached the roof access without incident. Washington secured the maintenance shaft behind us as we emerged onto the hospital roof. The afternoon sun was bright after the darkness of the building interior. From our elevated position, I could see much of Riverdale and the surrounding countryside. The view was sobering. Plumes of smoke rose from several locations in town. Military vehicles formed blockades on major roads. In the distance, a helicopter circled what appeared to be the high school, one of the evacuation centers that had been established. Dr. Okafor led the group to a rooftop utility structure. "We've converted this maintenance building into a secure location. Solar panels for basic power, water collection system, stockpiled supplies. We can hold out here while we continue research." Inside, the space had been efficiently organized. Medical equipment occupied one section, sleeping arrangements another. A small communication station had been set up with various radios and a laptop connected to satellite internet. "You've prepared well," I observed. "We saw what was coming," she replied grimly. "When the first patients arrived 3 days ago, their symptoms didn't match any known pathogen. By the time we identified the fungal structures and tissue samples, infection was already spreading through the hospital. We lost the East Wing within hours." Washington added, "Military response was too little, too late. They're still operating under protocols for conventional outbreaks. Quarantine, containment, identification. This is something entirely different." I unpacked my research notes and samples, setting them on a work table alongside Dr. Okafor's medical data. "Let's combine what we know. My wildlife behavior maps show how the infection spread geographically. Your medical data tracks the progression within individuals." Maya and Eli approached us, curious about the research. Despite their age, they seemed remarkably composed given the circumstances. "You said you're a wildlife officer," Maya said. "Did the animals know this was coming?" Her question was perceptive. In a way, yes. They detected the threat before we did, altered their movements, avoided infected areas. Animals often sense environmental dangers humans miss. "Like how our dog wouldn't go in the basement last week," Eli noted. "He kept whining whenever we tried to take him down there." Washington looked sharply at the boy. "Your basement? Where was your home located?" "Orchard Street near the reservoir," Maya answered. Washington and Dr. Okafor exchanged glances. "That's very close to the warehouse district. Ground zero for the infection," she said. I pulled out my survey maps. "Show me exactly where your house was." Maya pointed to a location on the map. It was indeed near an area where I documented early wildlife avoidance behavior and some of the first fungal growths. "When did your dog start acting strangely?" I asked. "About 3 weeks ago," Eli said, "right after those really rainy days when it stayed hot." The timing aligned perfectly with my initial observations. "What happened to your parents?" I asked gently. Maya's expression darkened. "Dad works at the water treatment plant. He got sick first, 2 days ago. Mom took him to the hospital, told us to stay with neighbors. Then everything got crazy. We were trying to reach the evacuation center when Sergeant Washington found us." Washington nodded solemnly. "Their neighborhood was already being overrun. I was escorting civilians to extraction points when I found them hiding in a convenience store." This new information added an important piece to the puzzle. The water treatment plant was downstream from the warehouse district, where the military had identified the initial outbreak concentration. If spores had entered the water system— "Dr. Okafor," I said urgently, "did you test water samples from infected patients?" She shook her head. "We focused on blood and tissue analysis. The symptoms manifested primarily as respiratory, so we assumed airborne transmission. It might be both, I theorized. The spores could survive in water, especially untreated sources. That would explain the rapid spread beyond what airborne transmission alone would achieve. Washington considered this. The reservoir supplies water to the entire county. If it's contaminated, the quarantine would be ineffective, I finished. People would continue to be infected despite isolation. Dr. Okafor immediately moved to the communications station. We need to warn any remaining medical facilities and military command. While she attempted to make contact, I continued consolidating our research data. The teenagers joined me, proving surprisingly helpful in organizing information. Maya's good with computers, Eli explained as his sister quickly created a database for our combined research notes. She won the state science fair last year. Computational biology project, she said without looking up from the laptop. Tracking mutation rates in bacterial populations seems kind of relevant now. Her skills were indeed valuable as we mapped infection patterns against geographical features, weather data, and reported symptoms. A clear progression emerged. Following watersheds, then airborne transmission accelerated by the military bombing, creating concentric circles of infection from multiple points rather than a single source. Dr. Okafor returned from the communications station looking frustrated. Military channels are non-responsive. I reached a FEMA outpost near Grand Island, but they're operating on outdated information, still treating this as a conventional pathogen. What about CDC? I asked. Their last update was 12 hours ago. They've identified the fungal nature of the pathogen but haven't recognized the coordinated behavior patterns in infected individuals. They're focused on developing an antifungal treatment rather than understanding the collective intelligence emerging. That was the key insight the others were missing. This wasn't just an infection. It was creating a network, a hive mind that was rapidly evolving. We need to document the coordination behavior systematically, I suggested. Proven examples of strategic thinking, communication methods, adaptation to countermeasures. If we can demonstrate that this is more than random infected behavior, perhaps they'll listen. Washington nodded grimly. I've seen it firsthand. When we established the first quarantine checkpoints, the infected initially tested defenses directly. After taking casualties, they changed tactics, started using diversions, flanking maneuvers. By the second day, they were implementing complex strategies no mindless infected should be capable of. Almost like they were being directed by someone who understands military tactics, I observed. Exactly, he confirmed. After they overran the National Guard position at the high school, their coordination improved dramatically. They were using our own protocols against us. Dr. Okafor had been reviewing tissue samples through a portable microscope. There's something else you should see, she said, waving me over. These are samples from patients at different stages of infection. Through the microscope, I could see the progression clearly. Fungal structures increasingly integrated with neural tissue, forming new connections between previously separate systems. The fungus isn't just hijacking the brain, she explained. It's networking it, creating connections between infected individuals through some form of signal transmission we don't yet understand. The whispers, I suggested. They're not just communication, they're synchronization. She nodded. A distributed neural network across multiple hosts. Individual infected retain some autonomy but operate as components of a larger system. A decentralized intelligence, Washington added, understanding dawning. That's why destroying individual infected doesn't stop them. The network adapts. This realization changed everything. We weren't fighting individual infected. We were fighting a single entity distributed across many bodies. And it was learning from every encounter, incorporating the knowledge and skills of those it assimilated. If this theory is correct, I said slowly, then the infection has a central coordination mechanism but no central point of failure. Conventional containment strategies would be useless. Maya looked up from the computer. Like a neural network AI system, she said. Distributed processing across multiple nodes. The more nodes it adds, the more processing power it gains. Her analogy was disturbingly accurate. And each human it infects adds new knowledge to the system, I added. Military personnel would contribute tactical expertise. Medical staff would provide biological understanding. It's getting smarter, Eli whispered, the implications sinking in. Washington's expression hardened. This changes our strategy completely. We're not just avoiding infected individuals. We're dealing with a coordinated enemy force that's actively hunting us. Dr. Okafor returned to her microscope. If this distributed network theory is correct, there might be a vulnerability. All networks require communication protocols. Disrupt the protocol. Disrupt the network. The whispers, I said. If we could interfere with whatever frequency or mechanism they use to synchronize, we'd need specialized equipment to analyze the acoustic properties, she replied. The hospital's audiology lab might have what we need, but it's 2 floors down. Washington considered this. Too risky to attempt now. We need to secure our position here first. Take stock of supplies, establish more reliable communications with any remaining military or government response. As the group began organizing the rooftop shelter more efficiently, I moved to the edge of the roof to survey our situation. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across Riverdale. In the fading light, I could see movement in the streets below, the fluid, coordinated movement of infected groups, positioning themselves around the hospital. They knew we were here. They were preparing. I watched from the roof edge as darkness fell over Riverdale, allowing me to see more clearly what was happening below. The infected weren't just gathering randomly around the hospital. They were establishing a perimeter, positioning sentries at all potential exit points. They moved with military precision, maintaining communication through those whispers that carried eerily in the night air. They're setting up a siege, Washington said quietly, joining me at the perimeter. Standard containment protocol. Exactly what we would do to trap an enemy force. How many do you estimate? I asked. He scanned methodically. At least 30 visible from this vantage point. Probably more I can't see. They're concentrating on ground-level containment for now. They don't know we've reached the roof, I observed. Not yet, but they will. They're methodically clearing the building floor by floor. Process of elimination will lead them here eventually. As we watched, a military helicopter appeared in the distance, searchlights scanning the streets below. The infected's reaction was immediate and disturbing. They retreated into buildings and shadows, concealing their presence. Not the behavior of mindless zombies, but tactical evasion. They're hiding from aerial observation, Washington noted grimly. Adapting to our reconnaissance methods. The helicopter made a single pass over the hospital, then continued toward the military blockade we could see on the highway to the east. It never slowed or indicated awareness of our presence on the roof. They didn't see us, I said, disappointment evident in my voice. Or they're not looking for survivors anymore, Washington replied. Military may have shifted to pure containment protocol rather than evacuation. We returned to the rooftop shelter where Dr. Okafor was organizing our research findings with Maya's help. Eli and 2 nurses were inventorying supplies. How long can we sustain ourselves here? I asked. Water is our primary limitation, Dr. Okafor replied. The collection system provides enough for minimal drinking needs, but not much more. Food supplies will last about a week at current rationing. Medical supplies are adequate for now. What's our communication status? Washington gestured to the elderly man working at the radio station. Dr. Jensen has been attempting to reach any organized response teams. Limited success so far. Military channels are operating, but not responding to civilian communications. Dr. Jensen looked up from his equipment. I've made contact with several survivor groups in isolated locations. A farm collective about 20 miles north, a ranger station in the national forest to the west, a community college where some students and faculty are holding out. Are they aware of the true nature of the infection? I asked. Some are, he replied. I've been sharing what information we have, but communication is spotty and growing worse. Military is jamming certain frequencies, presumably to prevent the infected network from using them. Maya called us over to her laptop. I've compiled our combined data and created a progression map. Look at this. The screen showed a time-lapse representation of infection spread based on our observations and reports. It started with isolated points 3 weeks ago, precisely in the areas where I'd first noted unusual wildlife behavior, then expanded along waterways, followed by airborne transmission acceleration after the military bombing. If this model is accurate, she said, the infection has already spread well beyond the quarantine perimeter. The military doesn't realize they've already lost containment. Washington studied the map carefully. The bombing was yesterday morning, created a massive spore cloud that weather patterns would have carried northeast. He pointed to areas on the map. These communities would already be experiencing initial infections. The implications were chilling. The quarantine was failing, but the authorities didn't know it yet. There's something else, Maya continued. I've been analyzing the infected behavior patterns from our combined observations. There's a learning curve. She displayed a graph showing increasing sophistication of tactics over time. They're not just getting more numerous, they're getting smarter, more coordinated. The neural network is expanding, Dr. Okafor confirmed. Maya's good with computers, Eli explained as his sister quickly created a database for our combined research notes. She won the state science fair last year. Computational biology project, she said without looking up from the laptop. Tracking mutation rates in bacterial populations seems kind of relevant now. Her skills were indeed valuable as we mapped infection patterns against geographical features, weather data, and reported symptoms. A clear progression emerged. Following watersheds, then airborne transmission accelerated by the military bombing, creating concentric circles of infection from multiple points rather than a single source. Dr. Okafor returned from the communications station looking frustrated. Military channels are non-responsive. I reached a FEMA outpost near Grand Island, but they're operating on outdated information, still treating this as a conventional pathogen. What about CDC? I asked. Their last update was 12 hours ago. They've identified the fungal nature of the pathogen but haven't recognized the coordinated behavior patterns in infected individuals. They're focused on developing an antifungal treatment rather than understanding the collective intelligence emerging. That was the key insight the others were missing. This wasn't just an infection. It was creating a network, a hive mind that was rapidly evolving. We need to document the coordination behaviors systematically, I suggested. Proven examples of strategic thinking, communication methods, adaptation to countermeasures. If we can demonstrate that this is more than random infected behavior, perhaps they'll listen. Washington nodded grimly. I've seen it firsthand. When we established the first quarantine checkpoints, the infected initially tested defenses directly. After taking casualties, they changed tactics, started using diversions, flanking maneuvers. By the second day, they were implementing complex strategies no mindless infected should be capable of. Almost like they were being directed by someone who understands military tactics, I observed. Exactly, he confirmed. After they overran the National Guard position at the high school, their coordination improved dramatically. They were using our own protocols against us. Dr. Okafor had been reviewing tissue samples through a portable microscope. "There's something else you should see," she said, waving me over. "These are samples from patients at different stages of infection." Through the microscope, I could see the progression clearly. Fungal structures increasingly integrated with neural tissue, forming new connections between previously separate systems. "The fungus isn't just hijacking the brain," she explained. "It's networking it, creating connections between infected individuals through some form of signal transmission we don't yet understand." "The whispers," I suggested. "They're not just communication, they're synchronization." She nodded. "A distributed neural network across multiple hosts. Individual infected retain some autonomy but operate as components of a larger system. A decentralized intelligence," Washington added, understanding dawning. "That's why destroying individual infected doesn't stop them. The network adapts." This realization changed everything. We weren't fighting individual infected. We were fighting a single entity distributed across many bodies. And it was learning from every encounter, incorporating the knowledge and skills of those it assimilated. "If this theory is correct," I said slowly, "then the infection has a central coordination mechanism but no central point of failure. Conventional containment strategies would be useless." Maya looked up from the computer. "Like a neural network AI system," she said. "Distributed processing across multiple nodes. The more nodes it adds, the more processing power it gains." Her analogy was disturbingly accurate. "And each human it infects adds new knowledge to the system," I added. "Military personnel would contribute tactical expertise. Medical staff would provide biological understanding." "It's getting smarter," Eli whispered, the implications sinking in. Washington's expression hardened. "This changes our strategy completely. We're not just avoiding infected individuals. We're dealing with a coordinated enemy force that's actively hunting us." Dr. Okafor returned to her microscope. "If this distributed network theory is correct, there might be a vulnerability. All networks require communication protocols. Disrupt the protocol. Disrupt the network." "The whispers," I said. "If we could interfere with whatever frequency or mechanism they use to synchronize, we'd need specialized equipment to analyze the acoustic properties," she replied. "The hospital's audiology lab might have what we need, but it's 2 floors down." Washington considered this. Too risky to attempt now. The first infected reached the roof access door and began hammering against it. The barricade would only hold for moments. Others were visible climbing over the edge of the roof from multiple directions. "Fall back to the helipad," Washington ordered. "More defensible position." We retreated as the first barricade gave way. Infected poured onto the roof. Hospital staff still in partial uniforms, military personnel, civilians. All moved with that same fluid grace, communicating through whispers that now filled the night air. They didn't rush us directly. Instead, they spread out, encircling our position, cutting off escape routes. Tactical containment, just as they'd done with the building itself. Washington fired selectively, targeting infected who moved into key positions. Each shot was precise, but for each one he dropped, more appeared. They were using their numbers strategically, willing to sacrifice individuals to maintain the overall containment strategy. Dr. Okafor had brought her research materials, refusing to abandon her findings even in crisis. "If we don't survive, someone needs to understand what they're facing," she insisted. "The infected were tightening their circle when we heard the helicopter. The strobing lights had worked. A military chopper was approaching, spotlight scanning the rooftop. The infected immediately changed behavior. Some retreated from the light, while others moved into coordinated firing positions. They anticipated military intervention and were preparing a response. "They're adapting again," I said to Washington. "The ones in military gear are directing the others." "They're using our tactics against us," he confirmed grimly, "and they're learning with each encounter." The helicopter circled once, apparently assessing the situation. Then we heard a voice over a loudspeaker. "Survivors on rooftop, prepare for extraction. Clear the helipad area. Repeat, clear the helipad for emergency extraction." Washington immediately organized our retreat to the designated landing zone. "Everyone stay low and move fast. We'll have seconds, not minutes, when they touch down." The infected seemed momentarily confused by the helicopter's presence, their whispered communications becoming more rapid and complex as they attempted to formulate a response to this new development. As we positioned ourselves for extraction, I noticed one infected behaving differently from the others. While most were coordinating to encircle us, this one, a former hospital security guard based on his uniform, was moving toward the aircraft warning light control panel. "They're trying to deactivate the lights," I shouted to Washington. "They understand what drew the helicopter." Washington immediately shifted his aim and fired, stopping the infected before it could reach the controls. But the attempt itself was telling. Problem-solving behavior, understanding cause and effect, strategic thinking. The helicopter descended toward the helipad, rotors whipping the air. As it approached, the infected launched a coordinated rush from multiple directions. "Covering fire!" Washington shouted, positioning himself to defend our evacuation point. Chaos erupted as the helicopter touched down. Military personnel leaned out, providing suppressing fire to clear a path for our group. We moved as quickly as possible toward the aircraft, helping the less mobile members of our group. The infected pressed forward despite taking fire, using coordinated movements to minimize their exposure while continuing their advance. They weren't mindlessly charging. They were implementing tactical maneuvers to overcome our defenses. Dr. Okafor and most of our group reached the helicopter first. Washington and I covered their boarding, backing slowly toward the aircraft as the infected closed in from all sides. That's when I saw Eli fall. In the confusion of boarding, he had tripped and was now separated from the group, directly in the path of approaching infected. Washington saw it too and moved to provide covering fire while I rushed to the boy. I reached him just as the nearest infected closed in, managing to pull him to his feet and push him toward the helicopter. "Go!" I shouted, turning to face the oncoming threat. The infected closed in as I positioned myself between them and Eli. Washington provided covering fire, creating just enough space for the boy to scramble aboard the helicopter. I backed toward the aircraft, keeping my eyes on the approaching threats. They moved with that disturbing coordination, adjusting their approach to minimize exposure to Washington's fire while maintaining their encirclement strategy. I was almost to the helicopter when I felt hands grabbing my field jacket from behind. An infected had circled around our flank. I twisted away, breaking its grip but losing my balance in the process. I fell hard onto the rooftop as Washington shouted something I couldn't make out over the rotor noise. The infected that had grabbed me advanced with predatory precision. I recognized him as one of the hospital orderlies from his partial uniform. His movements were fluid, calculating, no wasted motion or mindless lunging. Washington fired, dropping the orderly, then extended his hand to pull me up. As I regained my feet, I saw more infected converging on our position. We weren't going to make it to the helicopter before they reached us. "Get them out of here," I shouted to Washington, pushing him toward the aircraft. "I'll draw them off." He hesitated for only a second before understanding the tactical necessity. Someone had to stay behind to ensure the others escaped with the research data. With a grim nod, he backed onto the helicopter, continuing to provide covering fire as I moved laterally across the rooftop, drawing the infected away from the extraction point. The helicopter lifted off as I ran, the infected immediately adjusting their pursuit to follow me rather than the departing aircraft. Their whispers intensified, coordinates and strategies passing between them as they spread out to cut off my potential escape routes. I needed to find an alternative way off the roof before they closed the trap. The building's maintenance structures offered limited cover but no viable exit. Then I spotted the external fire escape on the west side, partially rusted but still intact. Moving quickly between ventilation units and other rooftop equipment, I worked my way toward the fire escape, using the same principles I'd applied when tracking elusive predators in the wild. Minimal noise, irregular patterns of movement, staying low to break line of sight. The infected searched with unnerving efficiency, their whispered communications allowing them to coordinate their efforts without alerting me to their positions. It was like being hunted by a wolf pack that could communicate telepathically. I reached the fire escape and began descending as quietly as possible. The metal structure creaked despite my careful movements, and immediately the whispers above changed pitch. They had detected me. Looking up, I saw infected moving to the edge of the roof, preparing to follow. I needed to descend faster than they could pursue. Counting on the deteriorated condition of the structure to work in my favor, I climbed over the railing and dropped to the landing below, bypassing several flights of stairs. The impact sent pain shooting through my knees, but I had gained precious seconds. I continued downward, alternating between rapid descent on the stairs and controlled drops to lower landings when possible. The infected followed, moving with that same disturbing grace. They didn't descend as I did. Some began climbing down the exterior of the fire escape itself, using the framework as handholds, moving like the predatory hunters they had become. I reached the second-floor landing when the entire structure shuddered. Looking up, I saw multiple infected now descending from different points, their combined weight stressing the aging metal beyond its limits. With a grinding sound, the upper section began to pull away from the building. I had seconds before the entire fire escape collapsed. The second-floor window was my only option. I smashed through it with my elbow, feeling glass cut into my arm as I tumbled into the darkened hospital corridor. Behind me, the fire escape tore free from the building with a screech of metal, taking several infected with it. But I knew the reprieve would be temporary. Those that remained would find another way down, and there were surely more already inside the building. I found myself in what had been a patient wing, now abandoned. Overturned equipment and scattered personal effects told the story of hasty evacuation. Using my flashlight sparingly to preserve both battery and stealth, I navigated toward what I hoped was the center of the building. My goal was to reach the service elevator shaft we'd used earlier. It might provide a route to the ground floor and potential escape. The whispers began again, echoing through the corridors. Infected were in the building, searching. Their communication had a different quality now, more urgent, more focused. I had become their primary target. I moved silently, using all my wildlife tracking skills to avoid detection. Years spent observing predator movement patterns were now being applied in reverse. I was the prey, using prey tactics of misdirection and minimal sign. The infected were thorough in their search, methodically checking rooms and maintaining communication to coordinate their efforts. I evaded several by hiding in utility closets or under beds, holding my breath as they passed within feet of my position. I reached the central corridor and oriented myself. The service elevator should be 2 hallways over. As I moved toward it, I heard whispers from ahead. They had anticipated my route and positioned hunters accordingly. Ducking into a treatment room, I assessed my options. The central service shaft was blocked, but there might be another way down. Hospital designs typically included multiple emergency exit stairwells. I needed to find one that wasn't already being monitored. The room I was in had a hospital map on the wall showing emergency evacuation routes. I used my flashlight briefly to study it. identifying a maintenance stairwell in the northwestern corner that might be less obvious than the main emergency stairs. Before I could move, whispers approached from the hallway. I extinguished my light and slid beneath a hospital bed, controlling my breathing as footsteps entered the room. The infected moved with deliberate purpose, checking potential hiding spots methodically. From my position, I could see only their feet moving across the linoleum floor. 2 pairs of shoes, one in hospital scrubs, the other in what appeared to be security boots. They communicated constantly in those sibilant whispers, coordinating their search. One moved to check the attached bathroom while the other began examining the space around the beds. The infected in security boots approached my hiding place. I saw the feet pause directly beside the bed. Then, with deliberate slowness, the figure began to crouch down. I had seconds before discovery. Waiting until the infected was committed to the movement, I suddenly rolled out from the opposite side of the bed, simultaneously pushing the entire bed frame hard toward the crouching figure. The heavy hospital bed slammed into the infected, temporarily pinning it against the wall. The second infected emerged from the bathroom, but I was already moving toward the door. I grabbed a metal IV stand as I passed, swinging it to create space between myself and the pursuing infected. In the hallway, I ran not toward the stairwell, but in the opposite direction, intending to circle back once I'd broken direct pursuit. The whispers behind me grew louder, then multiplied as other infected joined the hunt. They were communicating my position through their network, I realized. Like wolves howling to signal the location of prey to distant pack members, they were coordinating a building-wide response to my presence. I turned corners rapidly, using my knowledge of predator pursuit psychology. Most predators anticipate prey continuing in the same direction or following predictable escape routes. By making erratic direction changes and doubling back, I might confuse their prediction models. The strategy seemed to work initially. The whispers became more scattered, less coordinated as I moved through the abandoned hospital corridors. I used this temporary advantage to work my way gradually toward the northwest stairwell I'd identified on the map. I reached a nurse's station and paused to check my bearings. The stairwell should be just beyond the next set of double doors. As I moved forward cautiously, I noticed something disturbing. The whispers had stopped completely. Silence in a predator-prey dynamic often indicates a shift to ambush tactics. They weren't actively searching anymore. They were waiting. I approached the double doors with extreme caution, listening for any sound from beyond. Nothing. Just unnatural silence. I pushed the door open slightly and peered through the crack. The corridor beyond appeared empty, but the stairwell door at the end was partially open. It could be an exit route or a perfect ambush point. I needed a way to determine if infected were waiting without exposing myself. Looking around the nurse's station, I found a drawer of medical supplies. Inside was a roll of bandage tape. I removed my flashlight, secured the tape to it, and carefully slid it through the doorway, using the tape to pull it along the floor toward the stairwell like a fishing lure. The response was immediate and chilling. 3 infected rushed from hidden positions, converging on the moving light. They had been waiting in perfect stillness. An ambush strategy I'd observed in apex predators but never expected in infected humans. I withdrew the flashlight by the tape, pulling it back through the door crack before they could follow the ruse to its source. Now I knew the direct route was blocked. I needed another way down. Returning to the hospital map at the nurse's station, I identified an alternative. A laundry chute in the nearby utility room that connected to the basement level. It wouldn't take me directly to the ground floor, but it would put me below the main search area. The utility room was 2 doors down. I moved silently, hearing the whispers resume as the infected realized their ambush had failed. They were recalibrating, adjusting their search parameters. Inside the utility room, I located the laundry chute, a metal-lined shaft about 2 feet in diameter. It was a tight fit, but I had little choice. The whispers in the corridor were growing louder, more numerous. They were converging on my position. I climbed into the chute feet first and used my arms to control my descent, bracing against the sides of the shaft to prevent an uncontrolled fall. The metal was cold against my back as I inched downward, trying to move quickly but quietly. From above, I heard the utility room door open. Whispers filled the small space as infected entered, searching. I froze in place, suspended in the chute, controlling my breathing to prevent any sound. A face appeared at the chute opening above, gray skin, dilated pupils, veined features. It whispered to others who immediately joined at the opening. They had found my escape route. I released my bracing hold and let gravity take me, sliding rapidly down the chute. The metal walls scraped against my clothing and skin as I descended into darkness. Above, the whispers grew fainter, then were gone entirely as I dropped below the reach of their voices. The chute ended abruptly, depositing me into a large laundry bin in what appeared to be the hospital basement. I landed hard but intact, immediately rolling out of the bin and scanning my surroundings. The basement was dimly lit by emergency lighting. Long corridors stretched in both directions, lined with pipes and electrical conduits. The air was cooler here, with a slight draft suggesting connection to outside areas. I oriented myself based on the hospital layout I'd seen. The basement likely connected to the loading docks, which would provide a potential exit. But I needed to move carefully. The infected communication network would already be alerting others to search the lower levels. As I moved through the basement corridors, I noticed something interesting. The emergency lighting was functioning, but other systems appeared to be operating on backup power or were completely offline. The HVAC system in particular seemed to be running at minimal capacity. This gave me an idea. If the ventilation system was compromised, spore circulation would be reduced in certain areas. The basement, with its separate air handling system, might have lower spore concentration than the upper floors. I checked my improvised mask to ensure it was still properly sealed, then continued toward what I hoped was the loading dock area. The whispers were absent down here so far, but I maintained stealth protocols nonetheless. Rounding a corner, I encountered a security door requiring keycard access. It was locked down, but the emergency override box was nearby. I broke the glass cover and pulled the manual release, hearing the satisfying click of the locking mechanism disengaging. Beyond the door was a large open area filled with hospital supplies and equipment, the main storage facility for the hospital. Among the shelving units and pallets, I spotted something promising. A golf cart with the maintenance department logo, likely used for transporting supplies through the expansive basement. The keys were still in the ignition. If it was operational, it would significantly increase my mobility and speed. But starting the engine would also alert any infected in the vicinity to my position. I weighed the risks against the advantages. Speed might be more valuable than stealth at this point, especially if I could reach an exit before they could organize a response. Decision made, I climbed onto the cart and turned the key. The electric motor hummed to life, thankfully quieter than a combustion engine but still audible in the silent basement. I immediately put it in motion, following signs toward the loading dock. The cart moved swiftly through the storage area and into a wide corridor clearly designed for freight transport. I accelerated, knowing that the sound would attract attention but counting on speed to outpace pursuit. Behind me, the first whispers began, echoing through the basement corridors. The infected network was responding, but I had a head start. The loading dock area appeared ahead, a large space with roll-up doors leading to the exterior. Most were closed, but one was partially open, showing the night sky beyond. Freedom was literally within sight. I drove the golf cart directly toward the partially open loading dock door, hope rising as the gap grew closer. 20 feet away, I noticed movement outside, shadows shifting in the darkness beyond the opening. The infected had anticipated my escape route and positioned themselves accordingly. I immediately changed direction, steering toward a different bay door that appeared fully closed. It was a gamble, but most loading docks have manual release mechanisms inside for emergency evacuation. If I could reach it before the infected converged on my position, I might still have a chance. Abandoning the cart while it was still moving, I used its momentum to continue toward my target as a distraction, while I broke left toward the emergency exit door I'd spotted near the freight elevator. The whispers were all around now, coming from multiple directions as infected entered the loading area from various access points. The emergency exit had a crash bar mechanism, designed to allow quick evacuation regardless of power status. I hit it at full speed, bursting through into the cool night air beyond. I found myself in what had been the ambulance staging area, now empty except for 2 abandoned emergency vehicles. Without hesitation, I ran toward the nearest ambulance, praying the keys would be inside. In crisis situations, first responders often leave vehicles ready for immediate use. The driver's door was unlocked, and to my immense relief, keys dangled from the ignition. Behind me, infected poured through the emergency exit I'd used. Their whispers changed tone when they spotted me, becoming faster, more urgent. They were coordinating pursuit, spreading out to cut off potential escape routes. I started the ambulance and accelerated away from the hospital, crashing through a lightweight barricade that had been erected at the parking lot exit. In my rearview mirror, I could see the infected already adapting to my escape, some climbing into other vehicles while others continued pursuit on foot. The streets of Riverdale were eerily transformed. Abandoned cars littered the roadways, some with doors still open from hasty evacuation. The infected moved through this maze with disturbing coordination, some positioning themselves to intercept my likely routes, while others maintained direct pursuit. I needed to get beyond the town limits, away from the densest concentration of infected. The military quarantine line was approximately 5 miles east, but that direction would take me straight into what Washington had called Operation Firestorm, the planned bombing. My best option was north, toward the nature preserve where I'd first discovered the fungal growths. The irony wasn't lost on me, heading toward the apparent ground zero. But I knew the terrain there had spent years mapping its features. If anywhere offered a chance to evade pursuit, it was there. I took a sharp turn onto a side street, hoping to break direct line of sight with my pursuers. The ambulance handled poorly at speed, top-heavy and prone to swaying on turns, but its powerful engine gave me a temporary advantage over any pursuing vehicles. After several more turns through residential areas, I reached the northern highway leading out of town. The road ahead was partially blocked by abandoned vehicles and military barriers, but the shoulder remained passable. I maneuvered onto it, maintaining speed despite the rough terrain. In my mirrors, headlights appeared, vehicles in pursuit. The infected were using functional emergency vehicles, police cars, even civilian trucks. Their coordination extended to vehicular pursuit tactics, with faster vehicles taking point while larger ones maintained steady pressure from behind. I pushed the ambulance to its limits, weaving through obstacles while searching for a turnoff that would lead toward the nature preserve. About 2 miles outside town, I spotted the access road I needed, a service route used by conservation personnel that wasn't on most maps. Taking the turn at dangerous speed, I felt the ambulance tilt alarmingly before settling back onto all wheels. The access road was unpaved, little more than a fire break through dense woodland. The ambulance wasn't designed for this terrain, but I had no choice but to continue. Behind me, some pursuing vehicles attempted to follow while others continued past, likely intending to circle around via other routes. The infected were demonstrating complex pursuit strategies, splitting forces to cover multiple interception points. The access road deteriorated further as it entered deeper forest. The ambulance bounced violently over ruts and exposed roots, threatening to become stuck with each passing moment. I needed to maintain enough speed to prevent bogging down, but not so much that I lost control entirely. After about a mile of increasingly difficult terrain, I spotted what I was looking for: a maintenance shed used by conservation teams, nestled against a hillside and partially concealed by vegetation. I'd used it during wildlife surveys and knew it contained basic supplies and equipment. I drove the ambulance directly into the dense brush beside the shed, cutting the engine and lights. The vegetation would provide temporary visual concealment from aerial observation, though it wouldn't fool ground pursuers for long. Grabbing my pack with research materials and the few supplies I had, I quickly moved to the maintenance shed. The padlock was still in place from my last visit months ago. I retrieved the hidden key from beneath a false rock, a security measure that now seemed laughably inadequate given what we were facing, but grateful it remained undisturbed. Inside, the shed was exactly as I remembered: basic tools, some emergency supplies, maps, and communications equipment. Most importantly, it had a trap door leading to a small cellar used for storing temperature-sensitive wildlife medications and biological samples. I could hear vehicles approaching on the access road, their engines laboring over the rough terrain. The infected would find the ambulance soon, then begin searching the area. The cellar might provide temporary concealment, but I needed a long-term strategy. The shed's radio equipment caught my attention. It was a standard conservation service model, designed to reach ranger stations and emergency services within a 50-mile radius. If operational, it might allow me to contact other survivors or determine the military's exact containment positions. I powered it up, keeping the volume minimal, and began scanning emergency frequencies. Most were static or automated messages repeating evacuation instructions. Then I caught a partial transmission that made my blood run cold. All units prepare for Phase 2 implementation. Operation Firestorm expanded to include sectors 13 through 17. New containment perimeter established at Highway 27. Estimated infection spread now exceeds initial projections by 300%. They were expanding the bombing zone and establishing a new quarantine perimeter much farther out than originally planned. The infection was spreading faster than their models had predicted, exactly as our research had suggested. I needed to warn Washington and the others if they'd made it to a military extraction point. They might be heading right back into danger if the military didn't understand the true nature of the threat. Finding the emergency broadcast frequency, I transmitted, "This is Ezekiel Harding, Wildlife Conservation Officer. I have critical information about the fungal pathogen. The spores survive incendiary attack. Bombing will accelerate spread through thermal updrafts. Repeat, Operation Firestorm will accelerate infection spread." There was no immediate response, just dead air. I tried again on different frequencies with the same message, hoping someone in authority would receive and understand the warning. While attempting communications, I continued preparing the cellar as a temporary refuge. I moved essential supplies down, created a barricade for the trapdoor, and checked the emergency ventilation system that had been installed to prevent gas buildup. The approaching vehicle sounds grew louder, then stopped. They had found the ambulance. Whispers became audible outside, the infected communicating as they began their search pattern. I estimated I had minutes at most before they discovered the shed. I made one final transmission. To any survivors receiving this broadcast, the infection is fungal, spreading through airborne spores. Standard masks ineffective. Infected coordinate through whispered communications, demonstrating collective intelligence that increases with their numbers. They can be temporarily disoriented by sudden loud noises or bright lights, but adapt quickly. recommend high ground, good air circulation, UV exposure to reduce spore viability. With that final warning transmitted, I powered down the radio and retreated to the cellar, closing and barricading the trapdoor behind me. The space was small, perhaps 8 feet square, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. A single battery-powered lantern provided dim illumination. I could hear them enter the shed above, their whispers penetrating through the wooden floor. They were searching methodically, moving items, checking every possible hiding place. It was only a matter of time before they found the trapdoor. In those moments of waiting, I reviewed everything we had learned about the infected. Their behavior wasn't random or mindless. It showed purpose, coordination, and increasingly sophisticated problem-solving. The fungal network was creating something unprecedented, a distributed intelligence using human hosts as both processing nodes and physical implements. The whispers above suddenly stopped. Complete silence fell, broken only by my own controlled breathing. Then came a new sound, scratching directly above the trapdoor. They had found it. I extinguished the lantern, plunging the cellar into complete darkness. If they breached the barricade, my only advantage would be familiarity with the space. I positioned myself in the corner opposite the entrance, where stored equipment would provide additional concealment. The scratching continued, becoming more focused, deliberate. Then I heard a new sound that chilled me, tools being used to pry at the trapdoor edges. They weren't just using brute force. They were employing appropriate tools for the task, problem-solving behavior at its most advanced. With growing dread, I realized something crucial about the infected dynamics. The fungal network wasn't just coordinating existing skills from its hosts. It was learning, synthesizing new approaches by combining knowledge across its distributed consciousness. As I sat in darkness, listening to them methodically work to reach me, I thought about Dr. Okafor's medical observations. The fungus wasn't destroying neural tissue, it was repurposing it, creating new connections. What if this wasn't just an infection in the conventional sense? What if it was something more intentional? The implications were staggering. If the fungal intelligence could coordinate across hosts, learn from each new infected individual, and implement increasingly complex strategies, then conventional containment was doomed to fail. We weren't facing a disease. We were facing an emerging rival intelligence. The trapdoor began to splinter as they applied leverage. I had perhaps seconds before they breached my hiding place. In desperation, I looked around the darkness for anything that might serve as a weapon or create another escape route. The cellar walls were solid stone on 3 sides, but the fourth, behind me, was partially earthen, reinforced with wooden supports. It had been built into the hillside, which meant there might be a way to tunnel out if the soil condition permitted. As the trapdoor began to give way, I frantically dug at the earthen wall, using a sample collection trowel from my pack. The soil was surprisingly loose, suggesting the possibility of creating an emergency exit if I had enough time. The trapdoor finally cracked open, whispers flooding into the small space as infected began to descend. I couldn't see them in the darkness, but their movements created distinct sounds. The soft impact of feet on the ladder rungs, the subtle shift of clothing, the continuous whispered communications. I continued digging silently, focusing on creating even a small opening that might allow me to reach the hillside beyond. The earthen wall began to give way, small streams of dirt falling as I excavated a narrow tunnel. If I could make it just 3 or 4 feet through, the slope of the hill suggested I might emerge on the other side. The infected were in the cellar now, moving with that disturbing fluidity even in complete darkness. They whispered continuously, using the sounds to coordinate their search of the small space. I froze in place, pressing myself against the partially excavated wall, controlling every aspect of my breathing and movement. They moved methodically through the cellar, checking each corner systematically. I could sense them getting closer to my position, their whispers intensifying as they narrowed their search. Just as I felt a hand brush against my leg, the entire hillside above us shuddered. A distant explosion rattled the earth, sending dirt cascading from the ceiling. Operation Firestorm had begun, ahead of schedule. The disruption momentarily confused the infected, their whispers becoming erratic, uncoordinated. I used that split-second advantage to continue my desperate digging, breaking through to the hillside beyond as another explosion shook the ground. I squeezed through the narrow opening, emerging onto the forested slope as the world around me began to burn. The night sky was illuminated by multiple fireballs rising from the direction of Riverdale. The military bombing had commenced, creating precisely the catastrophic spore dispersal event we had feared. Behind me, whispers emanated from the cellar breach as infected began to follow. Ahead, the forest was beginning to catch fire as incendiary material drifted on air currents. I was trapped between immediate pursuit and approaching flames. The forest ignited around me in a rapidly expanding circle as Operation Firestorm lived up to its name. The military strategy was brutally simple: burn everything to ash, hoping to destroy the infection in the process. Instead, they were creating the perfect dispersal mechanism for the fungal spores, superheating air that would carry them miles beyond the current containment zone. I scrambled up the hillside, staying low to avoid the worst of the smoke. Behind me, infected emerged from the cellar breach, their whispers almost drowned out by the growing roar of the forest fire. They maintained pursuit despite the flames, demonstrating once again their single-minded focus and coordination. The hilltop offered momentary clarity, a vantage point to assess my situation. Riverdale burned in the distance, multiple strike points creating a ring of fire around the town. The night sky glowed orange, smoke columns rising to form massive towering clouds illuminated from below. I needed to reach higher ground, away from both the approaching fire and infected pursuers. The nature preserve had a fire observation tower about 2 miles north, a steel structure on the highest point in the area. If I could reach it, I might find safety from the flames and a defensible position against the infected. Moving through burning forest requires counterintuitive thinking. Most people flee directly away from fire, but that often leads into the path of fastest spread. Instead, I moved perpendicular to the wind direction, skirting the leading edge of the fire rather than running before it. The infected attempted to maintain pursuit, but their coordinated hunting strategy was disrupted by the unpredictable fire. For the first time, their whispers seemed to contain confusion, conflicting directives. The network was struggling to adapt to the rapidly changing conditions. I used this temporary advantage to increase my lead, pushing through dense underbrush toward the ridgeline that would lead to the observation tower. Years of working in this terrain gave me navigation advantages they couldn't match, regardless of their collective intelligence. As I climbed higher, the air cleared slightly. I could see the full extent of Operation Firestorm now, a massive, coordinated strike covering most of Riverdale County. The military had committed fully to their containment by destruction plan, unaware they were accelerating the very spread they sought to prevent. Halfway to the observation tower, I paused to check my supplies and assess my injuries. The escape from the hospital and subsequent flight through burning forest had left me battered. Cuts from the window glass, bruises from the laundry chute, minor burns from falling embers. My improvised mask was intact, but becoming clogged with ash and soot, making breathing increasingly difficult. In my pack, I still had my critical research notes, the modified mask designs, water purification tablets, and basic first aid supplies. If I could reach the observation tower, these might be enough to sustain me until I could make contact with other survivors or military units outside the containment zone. The whispers behind me had faded, suggesting I'd temporarily broken pursuit. But I couldn't afford complacency. The infected network was demonstrating remarkable adaptability, learning from each encounter. They would adjust their strategy and resume the hunt. I continued toward the tower, moving more carefully now to preserve energy and avoid drawing attention. The forest was less dense at this elevation, transitioning to scattered pine stands interspersed with rocky clearings. Better visibility, but also less cover. As dawn began to break, I finally spotted the observation tower silhouetted against the lightening sky. The steel structure rose about 60 feet above the highest point of the ridge, offering commanding views of the entire region. During fire seasons, it would be manned by rangers monitoring for lightning strikes and other ignition sources. Now, it represented my best hope for survival. Approaching cautiously, I scanned for any signs of infected presence. The tower appeared deserted, its access ladder extending from ground level to the observation platform above. The surrounding area was open, with good visibility in all directions, defensible, but also leaving me exposed during the climb. I waited, watching for any movement in the tree line before committing to the ascent. Nothing stirred except wind-blown vegetation and smoke from the distant fires. Taking a deep breath through my increasingly ineffective mask, I began climbing. The ladder seemed endless, each rung requiring conscious effort from my exhausted muscles. Halfway up, I paused to scan the perimeter again. That's when I spotted them. Infected, emerging from the forest edge, moving with that distinctive, fluid grace. At least 5 individuals, spaced at strategic intervals around the tower base. They didn't rush toward me or attempt to climb immediately. Instead, they established a perimeter, cutting off potential escape routes. Their whispers carried faintly on the wind, coordinating, planning. They knew I was trapped on the tower. I continued climbing with renewed urgency, reaching the observation platform and pulling myself over the railing. The enclosed cabin was intact, its door secured with a simple padlock. I broke it open using a rock from my pack, then entered and immediately resecured the door with the interior deadbolt. The observation cabin was small but functional. Basic survival supplies, a desk with radio equipment, maps of the region pinned to walls, and a rudimentary sleeping cot. Most importantly, it had a water collection system attached to the roof, with a filtered storage tank that showed nearly full capacity. I moved to the radio immediately, powering it up and scanning emergency frequencies. Most were chaotic. Fragmented transmissions from military units implementing Operation Firestorm, civilian distress calls, automated evacuation instructions now rendered meaningless by the bombing. Then I found a clear, strong signal. Organized communication on a restricted frequency. All units report containment status. Sector 7, purge complete. Sector 8, purge in progress. New spore dispersion models indicate potential breach of secondary containment line, requesting additional resources for tertiary perimeter establishment. They were already detecting the failure of their strategy. The bombing wasn't containing the infection, it was spreading it further, faster, just as we had predicted. I transmitted on the same frequency. This is Ezekiel Harding, Wildlife Conservation Officer ID 47291. Operation Firestorm is accelerating spore dispersal. Repeat, your containment strategy is failing. I have research data confirming fungal pathogen characteristics and dispersion patterns. After a moment of silence, a response came. Unauthorized transmission on restricted channel. Identify your location for immediate extraction. I hesitated. Revealing my position might bring rescue, but it might also bring a strike team ordered to eliminate witnesses or evidence of the failed containment strategy. I'd seen enough military operations to know how they handled inconvenient truths during crisis response. Before I could decide, the infected below implemented their next move. Two had begun climbing the tower ladder while the others maintained position around the base. Their coordination was flawless, sentries watching all approaches while assault team advanced. I transmitted again. Be advised, I am pursued by approximately 5 infected individuals demonstrating coordinated tactical behavior. They are implementing military-style containment and assault protocols. The fungal network is demonstrating distributed intelligence capabilities. The response was immediate and chilling. Confirm your last transmission. Did you state coordinated tactical behavior and distributed intelligence? Confirmed, I replied. The infected are operating as a networked entity. Each new infected adds capabilities to the collective. They are problem-solving, adapting strategies, and implementing complex coordination across multiple individuals. A different voice came on the channel, more authoritative, older. This is Colonel Mercer, Joint Containment Command. We've received similar reports from other observation points. How confident are you in this assessment? 100%, I answered. I've been documenting their behavior progression for 3 days. I was working with Dr. Sarah Okafor at Riverdale General Hospital. We compiled comprehensive data on the fungal network's neural integration mechanisms. The infected aren't mindless. They're becoming a coordinated organism utilizing human hosts as nodes in a distributed system. The silence that followed suggested my information was being evaluated at higher levels. Meanwhile, the infected climbing the tower had reached the halfway point. Their ascent was methodical, steady, inexorable. Mr. Harding, Colonel Mercer finally responded, we have an extraction team approximately 20 minutes from your position. Can you confirm your exact location? I described the observation tower coordinates. Be advised, he continued, our latest atmospheric modeling shows extensive spore dispersion from Operation Firestorm. The extraction team will require your research data to update containment protocols. Secure that data at all costs. The infected climbers were nearing the platform. Soon, they would be attempting to breach the cabin. I needed to buy time. The observation tower included standard firefighting equipment, including emergency flares. I grabbed one and moved to the window facing the approaching infected. Activating the flare, I tossed it onto the metal platform outside the cabin, where it burst into brilliant crimson light. The effect on the infected was immediate and unexpected. They recoiled from the intense light, their whispered communications becoming erratic, disorganized. The bright flare appeared to disrupt their coordination temporarily. I reported this observation immediately. Colonel, the infected respond negatively to intense light sources. Specifically, the red emergency flare caused temporary disorganization in their communication patterns. This suggests a vulnerability in their sensory integration. Understood, he replied. We've observed similar responses to certain electromagnetic frequencies. Maintain your position. Extraction approaching from northeast quadrant. Looking in that direction, I could see a helicopter emerging from behind distant hills, moving rapidly toward the tower. The timing would be close. The flare was already diminishing in intensity, and the infected were beginning to recover their coordination. As the helicopter approached, the infected implemented a new strategy. Rather than continuing their direct ascent, they began rocking the tower structure itself, creating an oscillating motion that increased in amplitude with each coordinated push. They were attempting to destabilize the entire tower. The observation cabin swayed alarmingly as the helicopter came into hover position above. A rescue harness was lowered through the roof hatch, accompanied by suppressing fire that temporarily drove the infected back from the tower base. I secured my pack containing the research data, then connected the harness and signaled readiness. As I was lifted through the roof hatch, I had a momentary view of the infected below regrouping, their whispered communications clearly audible even over the helicopter noise. They were already adapting to this new threat, formulating counter-strategies. Inside the helicopter, I was secured by military personnel in full hazmat gear. Colonel Mercer himself was present, distinguished by the command insignia on his protective suit. "Your research," he demanded immediately. "Let's see it." I handed over my pack containing all documentation, from the initial wildlife behavior changes through the hospital observations and analysis. He began reviewing it immediately, conferring with scientific personnel also present in the aircraft. As we flew away from the observation tower, I watched through the window as the infected below resumed their whispered communications. Their movements became more organized, more purposeful. Several returned to the forest edge, disappearing from view rather than maintaining futile pursuit. They were conserving resources, I realized, prioritizing strategic objectives over tactical opportunities, thinking long-term. "This confirms our worst fears," Colonel Mercer said, looking up from my notes. "The fungal pathogen is creating a distributed neural network across infected hosts. Each new infected adds processing capability and knowledge to the collective." "It's evolving," I agreed, "learning from every encounter, every host it acquires. The military personnel it infected have contributed tactical knowledge. Medical staff provided biological insights. It's incorporating our own expertise and using it against us." The colonel nodded grimly. "Operation Firestorm was based on conventional pathogen response protocols. Your data shows why it's failing. We're not dealing with a conventional pathogen." The helicopter banked sharply, heading away from the burning remnants of Riverdale toward what appeared to be a major military installation being established at the edge of the projected contamination zone. "We're establishing a research command center here," Colonel Mercer explained, "bringing in specialists from every relevant field. Your wildlife officer perspective has provided insights our conventional medical and military analysts missed." As we approached the base, I could see the scale of the operation. Dozens of prefabricated structures, vehicle depots, aircraft, and a fully established perimeter. The military was mobilizing substantial resources, suggesting they recognized the true magnitude of the threat. We landed at a designated arrival zone where I was immediately directed toward a decontamination facility. Before entering, I turned to Colonel Mercer. "The others who were evacuated from the hospital roof, Dr. Okafor, Washington, the teenagers, did they make it here?" He nodded. "They're already integrated into our research team. Dr. Okafor's medical insights, combined with your behavioral observations, are forming the foundation of our revised response strategy." Inside the decontamination facility, I underwent thorough protocols to remove any potential spore contamination. As I showered and changed into provided clothing, I contemplated the scale of what we were facing. Not just a pandemic, not just a zombie outbreak, but the emergence of a new form of intelligence, one that understood us intimately because it was made from us. After decontamination, I was escorted to the Research Command Center where familiar faces greeted me. Dr. Okafor looked exhausted but determined, working alongside military scientists at a data station. Washington was briefing security personnel on infected tactical behaviors. Maya and Eli were helping organize and digitize research notes. Dr. Okafor embraced me briefly. "We thought you didn't make it," she said. "When the helicopter returned without you." "Had to find my own way out," I explained. "But I brought all my documentation and observations." "They'll be invaluable," she assured me. "We're beginning to understand the fungal network's capabilities and limitations. There are weaknesses we can exploit." Colonel Mercer called the research team together for a briefing. Maps displayed on large screens showed the current infection spread, far more extensive than I had imagined, already reaching into neighboring states despite containment efforts. "Operation Firestorm has been terminated," he announced. "Based on new data, we're implementing Operation Blackout instead." Dr. Okafor and Mr. Harding's research suggests specific environmental factors that inhibit spore viability and network coordination. Dr. Okafor explained, the fungal network requires specific environmental conditions to maintain optimal communication. Particular humidity levels, temperature ranges, and most importantly, consistent electromagnetic field exposures. Disrupt those conditions, and we disrupt their coordination capabilities. I understood immediately. Like how they reacted to the emergency flare. Intense light disrupted their communication temporarily. Exactly, she confirmed. We're developing broader spectrum disruptors that should create larger dead zones in their network. Washington added, we're also establishing new containment protocols based on your observations of their tactical adaptations. Understanding them as a learning entity rather than mindless infected changes our entire approach. For the first time since the outbreak began, I felt a glimmer of hope. We were finally approaching the problem with appropriate respect for what we were facing, not just an infection, but an emerging rival intelligence. As the briefing concluded, Colonel Mercer addressed me directly. Your background in predator-prey dynamics and ecosystem management gives you a unique perspective on this threat. We'd like you to lead a specialized observation team, documenting infected behavior patterns and testing disruption strategies in controlled conditions. I nodded, accepting the assignment. They're like an invasive species, but one that learns and adapts faster than anything we've encountered. We need to understand them to have any hope of containing them. That night, from the safety of the military compound, I watched distant fires still burning where Riverdale had been. The infected were out there, spreading, learning, evolving. Our struggle was just beginning, but at least now we understood what we were fighting. The fungal intelligence had emerged and established itself with frightening speed, but humanity has always been adaptable, resilient. We created the Ranger Station where I'm recording this now, a forward observation post designed to monitor infected activity patterns and test countermeasures. The whispers continue outside, more complex now than 3 days ago when this all began. They're learning our patterns just as we study theirs. This recording contains everything I've observed about their behavior, their weaknesses, their communication methods. If you're hearing this, you've survived the initial outbreak, but the war for survival is just beginning. Listen for the whispers. They reveal where they are, what they're planning. But never forget what those whispers represent. Not mindless infected, but a coordinated intelligence that knows exactly what it's doing. An intelligence made from us, that thinks like us, but isn't us anymore. This is Ezekiel Harding, Wildlife Conservation Officer. Stay alert, stay alive. And remember, nature always finds balance, even in catastrophe. Our job now is to ensure humanity remains part of that balance.